and move on to the next session, which is embodied carbon, reduce, reuse, and sequester. And I'm glad that we're getting to that last word, because a lot of what we've seen here in the last hour and more is really a talk about moving to just as Caroline said a number of times, the term that she used is this notion of really regenerative design, and that we really are not just getting to zero, but getting beyond zero and really thinking in carbon positive terms. And that really kind of sets us up for this session, where we're going to have with us today two more fantastic panelists, with Paul Stoller. Hi, Paul, been a while, good to see you again, who's joining us today. Paul is the Managing Director of Atelier 10's Australia office, and also their global leader on their benchmarking practice. And Paul is joining us today from Sydney. I've met him when he was joining us from New York many years ago. And then also with us today is Jeremy Mansfield, who is the National Sustainability Operations Manager for Lendlease, which I don't know if it is the largest construction company in the world, but it certainly is one of the largest. And also, again, joining us from Australia in their Australian business unit, and he's joining us from Brisbane. Really wonderful to have you both here today. And again, this is kind of a session that's going to switch a little in two ways. One is it's always kind of starts with really the basis of talking about operational carbon, and we want to really spend a few minutes and talk about embodied carbon. And then also really how this is taking us really directly into that sequestration mindset, that regenerative mindset. And with that, Paul, I'm going to invite you to take over and share the screen, and we'll go through your presentation. Again, we have time for the two presentations, and then we'll have a little Q&A at the end. So Paul, it's all yours.
Thanks, Carl. Great to see you and hear from you again. Jeremy, if it's okay, I'm going to ask you to go first. I'm having a small technical connection issue that Lindsay's taking care of in the background for us. So if you're all set, Jeremy, could I ask you to start?
Sure, I can do that for you. No
Thanks,
worries.
mate.
So good afternoon, and thanks, Carl, for the introduction and the opportunity to present today. So hopefully my screen's come up okay. Just checking.
You're good.
Excellent. So I'm really thrilled to talk about embodied carbon. It's a topic for too long that seems to be the elephant in the room that no one tends to notice. So I hope this event and the focus on this aspect will help to share some light. Today I'm going to share a bit of insights into Lendlease's commitments to climate action, share some examples of our project into demonstration of both embodied and sequestered impacts, and discuss some of the barriers and challenges in adopting low carbon materials for our most significant materials that we use. And from there...
Do you mind sharing full screen? We're seeing presenter mode.
Ah, that's weird.
Thank you.
That's really weird. So, our sustainability framework was released in 2009, and at that point in time, we identified that we wanted to establish some key bold environmental and social targets. For context and for Carl, yeah, I don't think we're the biggest construction company in the world. We are, though, an integrated property and construction company. So there's a design and construction company around the globe, as well as both a developer and property owner and investor and operator. So the context of our footprint is quite broad. In terms of our sustainability targets that were launched as part of our annual report, we identified and committed to being a 1.5 degree aligned company, and also a commitment to creating $250 million worth of social value by 2025. In the context of that, we also supported and committed to net zero carbon scope 1 and 2 by 2025. That's the fuels we burn and the power we consume. And a commitment to absolute zero by 2040 in terms of the goods we buy and the activities we facilitate. Clearly, that commitment to an absolute zero carbon by 2040 is a substantial challenge because we're applying that across all our different types of business activities. In terms of our key steps for a decarbonisation, these look like, as you can see on the screen, the 5 key steps in terms of that. The key aspects for us in construction are 2, 3 and 4. These relate to phasing out diesel and gas in our operations, use of 100% renewable electricity before 2030, and collaborating with our supply chain partners to set pathways to achieve absolute zero carbon by 2040. Some of the other aspects there are relating to primarily our asset owner and operations of our assets as well. Building on this, these commitments is our track record. We've committed last year in terms of achieving our carbon neutral status for our construction business here in Australia, fully accounting for our emissions for all of our projects going forward. In line with that, we've got a commitment through our site standards to actually reduce our impacts through construction that we've had in place for some time, and we've just updated that to make a significant more impact around reducing our carbon through decarbonisation. We've also achieved the first Climate Active certification, which is a third-party certification of accounting for emissions in construction, and become a member of Responsible Steel. Other examples, offerings and services we provide now include climate neutrality certification, whether that be for construction, embodied carbon or building operations. So that's fully accounting for the emissions at those various stages and accounting for that through a third-party certification process. We've got a focus on low carbon design, climate resilient design, and making sure that we're accounting for carbon price liability impacts through the building life stages, as well as being committed to the Task Force for Climate-Related Disclosure, accounting for that in our reporting. One example of our commitments has been around timber buildings, and we've been building and in this journey since about 2009. One of the latest projects that I was involved with is 25 King. It is Australia's largest commercial timber building. It has a 74% reduction in carbon over the 60-year life compared to reinforced concrete building. 38.7% is the reduction in embodied carbon, which excludes the sequestered carbon, which makes up the balance. It's also achieved a 6-star Green Star Design As-Built rating, which is equivalent to a LEED Platinum. And we believe this is the first timber building to have achieved a Platinum Well Core and Shell certification as well. The project has really demonstrated at scale, and this is 45 metres tall, what's achievable in terms of delivering significant benefits here. And apart from the carbon story, there's many other benefits of bringing nature into the work environment, and also various other aspects to that in terms of safety of construction, etc. But we don't have time for that today. Interestingly, I thought I'd share this to highlight through the life cycle assessment that prefabricated materials, transport, and the types of construction processes have the most significant impact. For this particular project, the scale of the project and when we delivered this project was such that the available cross-laminated and laminated veneers weren't available in Australia at the time, so it had imported in from overseas. There's now supply into Australia, but it's clear that those kinds of trade-off issues are certainly some of the aspects you need to consider. There's also a comment, I guess, on that every project is different. Timber design requires design early freezes. Because the degree of fabrication can be quite large, the locking in of that design early needs to be considered in terms of planning and the just-in-time logistics that you require to bring that about on site. It also changes the nature of work on site and does end up with a reduction in labour on site, but certainly requires just as much coordination in terms of logistics. Now on to a low embodied carbon materials research report that we undertook recently and shared to the industry. This looked at the perceived and experienced barriers to low carbon materials, and we focused on concrete, steel and aluminium because it makes up 70% of the embodied carbon in our construction buildings. I remember Luke sharing earlier the 2% global statistic. Well, concrete, steel and aluminium make up 70% of the embodied carbon traditionally in our common building practices. The 5 recurring barriers highlighted a systemic range of themes that I've shared here. We don't have enough time to go through these in detail, but certainly focusing on those tendering and procurement barriers, those cost barriers, the technical and performance standard issues, knowledges and perceptions, and maybe past experience of earlier product not being adequate, as well as other governance and policy uncertainty barriers. So there's plenty of things that we've identified through this engagement process that highlighted there's a lot of work to do to address these systemic issues. The first step, though, is really to request low embodied carbon outcomes. And I thought I'd share with that a number of key things to make an effective low carbon project request. And these kind of boil down to 5 key areas of establishing a clear target, having a process of verification that is credible, getting the context of how to do that right, and asking for it early enough that it can actually be achievable, not at the last minute when you're about to start construction. And making sure that the criteria is clear about what you want, and making sure that the supply chain understand that they need to be on the journey to understand the credentials of where their resources and their production manufacturing comes from. So in doing that, we identified that we've got things that we can do, but there are other things that we need to work work collaboratively on. So this is really sharing that it really does require an industry-wide approach, and that collaboration will help to drive that, because there are systemic barriers to be addressed in unlocking the opportunities. And so it really kind of does highlight that we're all in this together to ensure that we can achieve that 1.5 degree target. So that's enough from me, and apologies to the start of my presentation. I'm not used to doing a Zoom, obviously, with the notes. If you want to see the report that we just released, it can be accessed at this address.
Well, thanks so much, Jeremy. Paul, have you worked out your technical issues there?
I think I have, with much credit to Lindsay. Thank you very much.
Okay, it's all yours then.
All right, keep your fingers crossed. With a little luck. Should see my screen.
You're good.
Terrific. All right, well, thanks very much for having me. It's great to be a part of this panel, especially speaking with Jeremy. It's nice to see you again. And Carl, terrific to see you again. It's been a while, too long. So we've been very fortunate at Atelier 10. We've been talking about carbon nearly since we were founded 30 years ago. One of the challenges has always been, though, that carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases generally are invisible and hard to fathom. And as Paul Finch said in the introduction to our book a few years ago, if only carbon still stank, we wouldn't need this webinar today to talk about how to grapple with it. It's the challenge, one of the challenges of the invisible aspects of the built environment. So I mentioned we've been grappling with carbon for 30 years conceptually. That said, it took nearly 18 years to get from when we started thinking about carbon when we were founded in 1990 to our first building that had an explicit zero carbon mandate to open up around 2008. And then it was nearly 5 or 6 years before we had our next low carbon building online and operating in about 2012, the World Wildlife Foundation headquarters outside of London. Then it was a few more years to our next one at Frick Park in Pittsburgh, a Living Building Challenge building. Then we got to work on the extraordinary Lendlease project, Jeremy, Barangaroo here in Sydney, 2014 as well. And then from then on, it's been like the floodgates have opened up. And now just about every project we work on, there's some sort of aspiration to lower zero carbon. And as signatories of the Zero Carbon Challenge, we are now making that an issue in every project of ours. So the point here is the rush to deal with carbon is a very recent one. It's taken a long time for industry to get to the point where we talk about this regularly, but it is great to be here. And just a few notes and things that keep us moving forward in this journey. Our first expressly zero carbon embodied carbon building, the World Wildlife Headquarters, we had to put in a lot of hard work just to calculate what the embodied carbon was, an extraordinary amount. It's like the early days of Green Star or LEED or the other benchmarking systems. There wasn't very good data. So this was done with Sturgis Partners, early low carbon, embodied carbon consultants in London. Through lots and lots of hard work, we got embodied carbon down by over 40% at no extra cost. And that's an important takeaway that's kept us driving hard on this topic ever since. It's about better design decisions, not throwing money at problems. Got a beautiful building, substantially lower environmental footprint right now when we need it. I mentioned Barangaroo. This was a big learning experience for me, just in terms of recognizing how far we've come as an industry and putting together all of the other procedural stuff to make zero carbon possible. Renewable power purchase agreements, carbon offset agreements, things we have to do for big urban projects where we need to deal with carbon mitigation and carbon sourcing, renewable power sourcing from offsite. Barangaroo is at the very early end of very front end of this process. They had very hard yards to put together these processes, but even in the 5 or 6 years since that hard work was done, as an industry, that work has all become much more every day. It's not very difficult anymore to buy renewable power in many places we operate, not all of them, but many. It's not so hard anymore to buy offsets. So we have now the instruments and mechanisms and processes to achieve zero carbon, which is a huge step forward. And now one of the things we're finding that's really turned the tide is big tech, who are desperate for talent, has become passionate about zero carbon because their talent, the tech folks, are passionate about zero carbon. So many of our projects, especially for tech companies, are making zero carbon an explicit project mandate. And everyday big office projects are becoming low or zero carbon, like this Adobe headquarters building in San Jose that we've been working on with Gensler, or the Google headquarters in London we've been working on with Big and Heatherwick. Both have low or zero carbon mandates. And this has become their business as usual. And because it's the business of key tenants to be zero carbon, it's now the business of the big property companies of the world to be zero carbon. In the UK, British Land, the Portland Estates here in Australia, GPT, Dexis, AMP, more and more of them are all tipping over carbon neutral. And our Australian green building benchmarking tool, the Green Star for New tool, is in its just about to be released next generation, going to be requiring that projects be zero carbon. So we are now in the world of zero carbon buildings, which is a super exciting moment to be in our practices. Carbon by the numbers. When we talk about zero carbon, what are we talking about and caring about? Traditionally, we've cared about operational carbon because for most current buildings over a 60-year lifespan, that is the majority of the energy. But as we rapidly drive carbon out of operations through better efficiency, all electric buildings, as we heard Luke talk about, the embodied carbon is becoming the much bigger portion. And by when we get to 2030 levels of energy efficiency, carbon will be the preponderance, embodied carbon will be the preponderance of energy. Here's a graph showing the embodied carbon and how it marches forward into time and how long it's taking the operational carbon to catch up for our most efficient buildings. So 80% of the embodied carbon in the first years of the building's life is embodied. And that's, of course, as we all know from the world of climate science, the carbon we care about right now really matters. When we talk about a building with good carbon, what are we talking about? These are RIBA targets from the UK. So they've established for embodied carbon a target building average of 650 kilograms of carbon emissions per square meter. They use a metric, we can apply it to all sorts of buildings. Compare that to operational carbon. Their good 2025 building target in the UK is 27 kilowatt hours per square meter per year. That's less than a factor of 10. It just shows you the importance of the embodied carbon right now. We have to get that down. How do we do that? We do it just like we tackle every other design exercise. We spend a lot of time figuring out where are the big users of carbon, and it's the stuff you'd expect, the concrete, the steel, the big systems that have the bulk of the building mass. And then we go to work on changing up the materials whole scale, swapping in timber for steel, or reducing structural through more efficient design with our structural engineering colleagues. And we go to work on the concrete mixes and on the steel sourcing and on everything we can to just get it down, get it down, get it down, get it down. And you can see again, with no added construction cost in most cases, substantial carbon emissions reductions in this project in Monterey, San Mateo, for example. So beyond tackling the new building and how we work it, let's talk about building reuse, because this is where some of the biggest wins in recycled or reducing carbon emissions come from. We are conceptually moving from a linear economy kind of way of being, as we've heard other speakers talk about, through a recycling economy and onto a circular economy where there is no more waste. And in buildings, of course, this means we need to be much smarter about our existing building stock, our pre-loved buildings, as we call them euphemistically here in Australia, which are sometimes beautiful, heritage, gorgeous structures and are sometimes not particularly nice. But the embodied carbon of these buildings is very important. And in a case study we did for an academic building at Cal State in LA, you can see by doing a deep green retrofit of this existing structure, we got our embodied carbon down by half relative to a new code compliant building. And where I practice here in Sydney, Australia, is a particular hotbed of major existing building reuse. So I mentioned AMP, they're one of the big property companies in town, amongst other things. They've got major sustainability commitments. This, in the leftmost image, you see their old, one of their old office towers. That is being majorly repurposed, adaptively reused into a brand new fancy pants 21st century office tower through the reuse of almost all of that existing skyscraper. Rather than tearing it down and starting over, they are entirely redoing it, but keeping all of the embodied carbon, embodied structure. A huge reduction in embodied carbon through this process. And just down the road, the old Sydney Water Building, one of Australia's tallest when it was built in the early 60s, was stripped of its skin, brought back to its basic steel structure, and that is now the base of a much taller, very fancy place where you could buy an apartment in the near future. This building's just about to open. So we are seeing, again, really exciting to note this trend, major urban buildings of scale getting adaptively reused, which substantially reduces embodied carbon. So there's great precedent for this. Going beyond, how can we use our built environment projects to sequester carbon? How can we soak it up? Jeremy talked very eloquently about Lendlease and their timber buildings. They're doing beautiful timber buildings. We all know that timber absorbs carbon as it grows, so it starts out with a carbon kind of surplus or a carbon budget that helps offset the carbon of the rest of the building. There is a major question about what happens to that timber at the end of its life. If it goes to landfill, as we are still to want to do with our building materials, of course that becomes emissions, but that's 60 years down the road. We've got an immediate climate emergency, so there is much sense to building with timber. Also, it's a unit material that in theory is easy to reuse when it reaches end of life. We're also doing a lot of work on landscapes and carbon sequestration. They continue to actively sequester through landscape growth, and we partnered with CMG Landscape in San Francisco to create this tool, CarbonPositive Design, that helps landscape architects and civil engineers tune up landscape design to sequester more carbon. So this is a very handy tool. Go to the website to check it out. Put this to work in your own landscape and civil projects to drive carbon sequestration into the land wherever you have growing stuff to sequester that carbon. And the last point I want to make is, as architects, especially engineers also, we like to control everything. We like to design everything. We like to be right on top of it. But we have to move to offsite solutions for carbon emissions sequestration to take care of our embodied carbon. And there's a great opportunity here. And we should give up the sense that we control everything and it's all exactly calculated, as we like to do in property, and embrace the extraordinary possibilities of partnering with projects out there that not only sequester carbon, but support cultural developments, regenerate landscape, regenerate habitat, which is a big deal, especially here in Australia, and have extraordinary secondary, tertiary, and further order benefits. And just to go back to a point that Carolyn made earlier in her talk, there's so much to be learned from the traditional owners here in Australia, where I'm speaking from, and these kinds of partnerships that solve an immediate property need to get rid of carbon, are also an extraordinary learning opportunity and a way to help help give new life to these traditional cultural practices. So I encourage you all to not only design your low carbon buildings, but also engage in the selection of a carbon sequestration portfolio and design ways for your organization to participate in a better future. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you, Paul. And let me ask you to stop sharing your screen and for Jeremy to turn his camera back on. And let's, with three of us, we've got about 10 minutes to take some questions and continue the conversation. So let me start by just saying that it seems like one of the things that both of you talked about is the challenge that we have today of really keeping kind of one eye on the horizon and thinking about a kind of systemic change, that we have to be part of a systemic change. And then yet we're doing this through projects. So how do you do that? How do you handle the immediacy of project goals and project budgets and project schedules and so on, while also understanding that, you know, you're really in that project kind of contributing to really building this systemic change?
Yeah, do you want me to go, Paul?
Go for it.
Go for it, Jeremy.
I think there's, yeah, you're right. And it's actually become something of a two-speed issue. One, the things that we can do on projects today versus being more strategic on particular supply chain suppliers of products to actually look broadly at the scale of the opportunity and how to engage that more broadly as a material issue that goes across many projects. So that if we can actually tackle that at both scales, then we're probably coming at it from both ends of the spectrum, from looking at, you know, the whole supply that we might get, for example, for aluminium globally, and actually then working out what we can tackle on individual projects based on various aspects. Because obviously the project context is everything, and we may not be able to adopt the application of certain opportunities for that particular product on that project. So we need to be looking at and engaging with the suppliers on a more broader scale, and we're certainly doing that through our supply chain team, as well as working with our project teams and working as far as we can up the chain with the design team to critically analyse the opportunities before it's too late in that process. Because once it's fully documented and we become kind of responding to the last minute request scenario, we have less influence over that. And the suppliers are telling us that as well. And it was one of the key barriers issues that said, we're getting too late into the conversation of telling you what we can offer. So the dialogue we're having offline, if you like, outside of projects, helps us understand what the opportunities look like, and doing that at scale. And then we can also then work out how we apply that at a project level, just based on kind of where that project's at and what context is it and how we can apply that. So it's a two-speed issue that we have to address this to really maximise the opportunities in that regard.
Paul, you want to add to that? I don't actually see Paul's screen anymore.
It's disappeared.
Paul, are you there? I'll tell you, early on this evening, I had 2 total blue screen of death crashes. So maybe Paul's trying to get back to us. So, you know, you're in the hot seat now, Jeremy. You know, you just, I hope you're feeling full of wisdom today. You know.
That's fine. It's not unlike how we feel about what is it going to take for us to get to absolute zero carbon by 2040. Because some of the things we know and other things that we're planning on in terms of when things will become more available. So there's some big challenges for us to tackle with that. And also because I think it's not only us working with the supply chain at the project level, but also more strategically, but also with clients and those that are looking at what their buildings are, to actually have critical discussions early on around the type of, the kind of things they want to achieve. Because if you late in the project decide you want to have a low carbon building and you've started out with a carbon intensive design, unscrambling that egg will be quite difficult. And instead of using the product for its best utilization in terms of the spans it can use and the capacity of those materials, you start trying to, do things at the margins rather than holistically looking at it early on in the design process.
So Paul, it looks like you're back.
I am, thank you.
Yeah. You want to add to the conversation about this kind of, project-based versus systemic, and how you really, work both sides of the block on that?
Yeah, as Jeremy said, I mean, the projects are everything. They give us the chance to figure out a better way forward. And certainly we look for the bigger projects to all have a big move that helps get noticed and build confidence and build the case studies to change an industry. We also work with our colleagues and stay in touch with our peers so that we are all driving towards common objectives so that we can help tip a market. And as I think it was, you mentioned, just talking about what Carolyn had said, something that's really exciting about practicing in Australia or Singapore or some of the countries over here is when they change as an industry, they change quickly. So when we reach certain critical mass moments or tipping points, the industry will flip over and something stops being a challenge and we get on with it. So we also look, especially in our planning projects, to reset expectations across multiple buildings or across precincts toward lower zero carbon outcomes. So that gives an early signal to industry to get the low carbon cement mixes, cements in place and the low carbon mixes ready, to get the lower embodied carbon steel onto the boats and over here to Australia, to do those things that not only make our projects better, but make every project in Australia better.
So this is going to be a little humorous, maybe slightly condescending, but I'll try to not do too much that way. But so we have at least two really clear messages from these presentations. One is build everything out of timber, and then the other is keep whatever it is you possibly can. Okay. So what's step three? What am I missing if those are just my two takeaways from what it means to be thinking about embodied carbon?
It would be remiss of me not to say that most of our projects involve concrete, steel, and aluminium more than anything else. So if there's anything we do, we need to tackle that challenge. Timber's great in the right context, but when you want very large spans or the types of topology of functionality that requires you to use different materials, we need to find the way to use that to their most effectiveness. So whether that be high tensile steel that's been manufactured through renewable technology, it's actually trying to get the right mix right for the intended use, because it's not always going to be timber, and that might be that at the moment it's still a bit of a niche market in some respects. But it does have great opportunities for use in various aspects where you could combine that with a steel or low carbon concrete solution to help bring those together. So I think that's trying to establish early on, as I said, in terms of establishing what are you trying to achieve and how do we best do that for functionality, for all the other things that your criteria that you're trying to respond to. Because at the moment we've kind of got this, it's that or this, and I think we need to go, that works for 8x9 or 9x9 or whatever spans. But if we want something that just really needs something bespoke, we need to consider that more deliberately. And we need to do it earlier up front to consider those things rather than seeing it as a report you produce because you've done a design and going, I've done something. You use it as a tool to evaluate, as Paul said, and doing more of that. I think the other thing is, and this is probably, it was raised in Carolyn's presentation, or a question about, when will the building codes start to introduce it? And I think some of that's conversation where we're starting a dialogue on with inviting them to industry conversations like one we did when we presented our report. It's clear that we don't yet have the language of what does low carbon mean? When you're asking for a low carbon product, what does that really mean? And so there's a lot of work needing to go into educate our sector around those kind of aspects, to go the kinds of things they need to ask more of. So I think we've got a little bit of a definite knowledge gap, as well as some definitions that industry need to land on, because I think we've been doing operational carbon for quite some time. And interestingly, for our construction business, embodied carbon is 80% of our footprint. But for our operational assets and property company, it's the smallest component. Theirs is any electricity and fuel usage. So we have this interesting area where, the focus is really heavily now on the construction industry because it's our biggest footprint that we need to address.
Oh.
And just building on what Jeremy said, specify, low carbon concrete, low carbon steel, low carbon aluminum if you can find it. Just keep hammering on the basics because not every building can be timber or something fancy pants. We need the everyday building trade materials that build the vast majority of our GFA to be driven by markets to much better product availability. So we just need to keep constantly specifying appropriate but much better performing materials. And also, just in case you're not already doing so, buying renewable power. I know that's operational and we've moved beyond that, but not enough people yet are buying renewable power. So make sure you're reminding your clients to do that.
And also, and on that, I think we've identified the two key things for the suppliers that are providing those products will be wherever we can get products that are generated using renewables, as well as maximising their recycled content, they will become the winners in the low carbon material space. And that's starting to emerge already when you start to compare the average carbon emissions, for example, aluminium versus best of breed in the world at the moment, which is, a tenth of, the more average version of that. So I think the extent of recycled content, post-consumer recycled content, in some of those materials, as well as renewable energy, will play a much bigger activity. And as cities become more renewable and that increases, and even Luke highlighted the extent to which China's doing that, which is one of our most significant manufacturing bases, that will be a great thing as we work towards, a 2040 target that we've got.
Yeah, just building on that point quickly, when we see numbers with the same product and one of them has a embodied carbon of a tenth of the other product, there's two thoughts. One, wow, this product is much better. And secondly, are they actually measuring the same thing? And there's a lot of work still to be done in industry, building on Jeremy's point again, to make sure when we talk about carbon, we're talking about the same thing, the same boundaries, the same measurement protocols, the same stuff, because there's very inconsistent data out there. And there's still a lot of hard yards across the construction industry to get to common reporting standards and common measurements and common language around embodied carbon and, let's say, the life cycle properties of materials. We're on the way. It's getting easier, faster, but there's still a lot of hard yards. So don't be surprised if you get lost in the sea of sometimes contradictory data. We spend a lot of time swimming in circles and getting our way out of those circumstances. I know Jeremy does with his work too.
Well, another thing that I feel like I take away from both of your discussion is that part of this is really thinking about carbon as an investment. And it's an investment of kind of a first cost equivalent, if you will. But it's also thinking about it as an investment over time. If you're going to invest a boatload of carbon in the necessary steel or concrete or aluminum or glass that you're using, to do it in such a way that you're really optimizing the useful life of that investment. And it's so parallel to so much of the other thinking that we do about making choices for buildings, that it actually does kind of bring the project and the systemic together, because that's how we think about buildings in those terms.
Just in building on that for you, Carl, it's turning the kind of, I guess, the current offsetting of what we produce to maybe, and it's been used in industry now in terms of insetting the investment we make, so we don't have to account for doing offset emissions. So that kind of discussion, or looking at the opportunities to do that within your supply chain, is a real opportunity now to work out, saying externality, we can price carbon and do offsets that gives us a dollar value, and we can understand what that might be into the future. But if we can turn that into investments that eliminates that need, because we're investing in our own footprint or our supply chain through an insetting or investment into that, then we can definitely change, the base starting position in terms of the carbon we produce.
Well, I want to thank you both. Once again, the clock on the wall is being really emphatic today. And I'm afraid to say that we're out of time. So thank you, Paul. Thank you, Jeremy. Really enjoyed both of your presentations. And I think this was a really terrific way to bring to a close the keynote sessions this morning. I do think that this embodied carbon issue it's kind of the emerging one. It's kind of the one we're trying to get our brains around and our arms around with our projects. And I think this was enormously valuable to really be thinking about really moving forward from here together, what we need to be doing to really get the whole picture. So again, thank you both. So for everyone who's participating here, this is the end of the morning keynotes. We're now going to take a few minutes to recognize the crucial partners that have been really important to essentially, essentially in making today's events possible. And with that, I'm going to sign off for now, and thank you very much for joining us today.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you, Carl, Paul, and Jeremy, and thank you to all of our wonderful keynotes this morning for your presentations, your insights, and your expertise. For all of our attendees that are joining us, thank you as well. If we weren't able to answer any of the questions you submitted live, we'll be sure to have our speakers answer that following this event, and then we'll post those answers on the CarbonPositive website. We'll also be recording all of the keynotes and the afternoon sessions, and we'll post those links on the CarbonPositive website agenda page as well. So as Carl mentioned, we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we'll be back with a 30-minute time for tool tutorials, which you can access on the CarbonPositive website agenda page. The link is shown here on the screen. Following that, in just about 40 minutes, we'll be starting up our afternoon concurrent sessions. So starting at 2 p.m. Beijing or 4 p.m. in Sydney. You can find all of the links to those on the CarbonPositive website agenda page. For those of you joining us from China, the links are also posted on the UPay website you access this keynote from. So with that, thank you all, and we look forward to seeing you in the afternoon sessions.